particularly in the beginning of the 20th century, where the term liturgical reform meant something very different depending on who you were talking to. Remember, you've got two understandings of this. Liturgical reform, meaning reform the people's understanding of the Mass so they can more beautifully appreciate it, versus reform the Mass itself. Two different schools of thought here. It didn't necessarily mean changing the liturgy, as we said, at least not significantly. It also meant reforming the sense of what the liturgy was all about, helping the laity to come to a much deeper appreciation of what is actually going on at Mass, what we call the theology of the Mass. Now, this is key. The Mass is a participation in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ to his Father for the redemption of mankind. That's why there's a priest. A priest offers sacrifice. This is why Protestant denominations don't have priests, because there's no sacrifice. What's offered in the Catholic Mass is Jesus Christ himself, his body and blood, soul and divinity, under the appearance of bread and wine. That is the central holding for the Catholic Mass, the sacrifice of the Mass. This is done in imitation of Christ himself, who instituted the Holy Eucharist in the moments before his passion and death. He did this in the context of a meal, as we know, the Last Supper. But the context of how he did it is not more important than what he did. It's that he was introducing himself, and this was a representation, a representation in advance, in anticipation of what was going to happen on Calvary. And it was something he gives to the church from time immemorial. That's the point of it. The point that it happens in a meal, in the setting of a meal, is not as important as the fact that there is a sacrifice going on. Then Cardinal Ratzinger said, the Eucharist that Christians celebrate really cannot adequately be described by the term meal. But if you go into tons of Catholic parishes these days, what do you hear? Oh, it's the supper. Oh, it's the meal. It's the supper meal. The word sacrifice you barely hear anymore. You barely hear anymore. So the emphasis is no longer on sacrifice, but it's on the meal. Indeed, if the sacrificial victim, as we understand this, is the sacrificial victim, and this is back from the Old Testament as well, if the sacrificial victim is not eaten, then the idea of the sacrifice being participated in doesn't happen. So the idea of a meal or supper is secondary to the sacrifice itself. That is Catholic theology, and that's what the entire Mass is built on, that theology. This is where Protestant and Catholic understanding of what happened in the upper room the night before Jesus' passion start to separate. And, as chance would have it, it's this dispute over the understanding of the liturgy where this reform, which way the reform goes, starts to break apart. Is it a sacrifice or is it a supper? Some wanted to change the emphasis of the Mass, while others wanted to improve the understanding of the Mass. It's very key to understand this. This becomes a whole sore point when people start arguing. The so-called conservatives and liberals start arguing. Change, change, change. Well, what's the change for? The change is to make us more appreciative of what's going on, or is it to just change the Mass? So be very careful when you hear the word change. It means two different things depending on which side you're talking to. As history has proved out, the one camp that won this was the one that wanted to change the Mass, not the one that wanted to make us more appreciative and understanding of the theology. When Vatican II began in 1962 under Pope John the 23rd, liturgical reform was just one of the items that was up for discussion and up for change by the Council Fathers. It was, however, though, in fact, the very first reform to come out of the Council. And it was largely driven by a group known as the Periti. Now, we mentioned those earlier. We had a quote from one of them. Periti were liturgical experts. The word Periti is Italian for expert. And they were extremely influential behind the scenes of what was going on at Vatican II. They were the ones who had the ideas in their minds of what should happen to the Mass, what the changes should be in the Mass. Now, they didn't have any power themselves, but one English fellow by the name of Douglas Woodruff, he was an outstanding English Catholic scholar, and he was editor of the newspaper, the British newspaper, The Tablet, during Vatican II. He said, "For in a sense, this council has been the council of the Periti, silent in the aula, but so effective in the commissions and at the bishop's ears." Catholic bishop of the counties of Cork and Ross in Ireland, Bishop Lucy, said, quote, "The Paridi were more powerful than most bishops, even though they had no vote, because they had the ear of a cardinal or the head of a national group of bishops, and they were influential in drafting the council documents." He said the expert is the person with the power. The first document to come out of the council was entitled Sacrosanctum Concilium. It means the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. It was promulgated on December 4th, 1963. What this document actually says becomes the whole sore point, the whole source of the heated debate that starts going on in the church and still goes on when people are running around in parishes. Oh, Vatican II said this, and Vatican II said that. Really? Have you read the document? And this is where our discussion must turn to a man by the name of Father Annibale Bugnini. He is the one figure who is crucial to our understanding of the changes that occurred in the Mass. So let's talk about him. First, the man. While it has never been completely established that he was a Freemason, he himself actually denied it up until his death. Leading intellectuals in the church, not the least of which were Dietrich von Hildebrand and his wife Alice, as well as many, many others, are convinced that he was a Freemason. Freemasonry was first condemned by Pope Clement XII in 1738 with a papal bull. Catholics were forbidden from joining Masonic lodges. The reason is that Freemasonry is a secret society opposed to many teachings of the Catholic Church. In fact, it is condemned outright as a force bent on destruction of the Catholic Church, not just a contrary opinion. According to Pope Pius XII in 1958, the roots of modern apostasy, listen to the language he's using, the roots of modern apostasy lay in scientific atheism, dialectical materialism, rationalism, Illuminism, laicism, and Freemasonry, which is the mother of them all. In fact, since 1738, and this is according to the Masons themselves, 8 popes have condemned Freemasons 17 times and reiterating the ban on another 400 occasions. And this condemnation has never been revoked. As a matter of fact, it was recently restated by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, obviously Pope Benedict now, when he was prefect for the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith, the CDF. He said, "The Church's negative judgment in regard to Masonic association remains unchanged, since their principles have always been considered irreconcilable with the doctrine of the Church, and therefore membership in them remains forbidden. The faithful who enroll in Masonic associations are in a state of grave sin and may not receive Holy Communion." So if anybody tells you the Freemason thing is, oh, we're kind of all buddies and chums now, yeah, let bygones be bygones. Well, the bygones haven't bygoned, they're still here. If Bugnini was a Freemason, and like I said, many, many people believe he was, if he was a Freemason, and the suspicion, as we said, is much more than just idle Roman gossip, then the changes that occurred in the Mass now take on something of a sinister nature. If he was a Freemason, then he was actively trying to destroy the Church by destroying the life of the faithful, by destroying the Mass, by introducing all of these changes into the Mass. Bugnini was the man who had the single greatest influence on the changes in the Mass. And we're going to show you how. This is how. About 15 years before Vatican II begins, Bugnini began intensive liturgical studies. He kind of became something of a liturgical expert. In 1948, he was appointed the secretary of Pope Pius XII's Commission for Liturgical Reform. In 1956, he became consultor to the Sacred Congregation of Rites. Now remember, 1956, we're starting to get up to Vatican II. Pope John the 23rd isn't there yet. The council hasn't been called, but he is moving to the forefront of the liturgical movement. In 1957, he becomes professor of sacred liturgy at the Lateran University in Rome. 2 years later, in 1959, Pope John the 23rd calls for the Second Vatican Council. And in 1960, he places Father Bugnini in a position which enables him to exert incredible influence on the future of the Catholic liturgy. He was appointed secretary to the Preparatory Commission for the Liturgy of the Second Vatican Council. In other words, he's the guy in charge of the committee that's looking at all of the changes in the Mass. He becomes the top dog, in effect, sort of the general on the ground. He was the driving force behind the drafting of what's called the preparatory schema.